Hi, and welcome to the BPD Bravery Show, where we discuss tips, strategies, struggles, triumphs, and success stories related to borderline personality disorder. Here is your host, Faye Green.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on our very first BPD Bravery Show. Today we have Dr. Skye Fitzpatrick from the TULiP lab in Canada, where they do amazing research on examining the emotion processes and treatment of BPD and PTSD. And at the end, she'll leave us with some great tips for people in relationships. It's actually for not only for people with BPD, but I think anyone and everyone could incorporate those in their lives. So thank you again for being here today. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
So much for having me.
Thank you for doing this. First of all, I know that and I might put you here in like a weird spot, but I know that it's called TULiP, right? The acronym for it. And I was reading on your site, it said something about, and I loved it. It said the reason why you chose it is because if you're a rose, don't be a tulip. Go to the rose garden. No, go to the tulip garden.
Yeah.
And kind of flourish. Do you want to explain that?
Love to, for sure. So
thank you.
So Marsha Linehan, who developed dialectical behavior therapy, you've probably heard of her. Yeah, she's really well known. One thing that she often has said is that people with borderline personality disorder are like tulips in a rose garden. And they, maybe due to the kind of emotional sensitivities that they're born with or the experiences they've had in their life that have led them to have certain kinds of sensitivities, they just aren't quite like other people in terms of how they feel and experience and work with emotion and what they need in terms of their emotions. But because they grow up in worlds and systems that don't always appreciate that, a lot of folks kind of develop this sense that there's something like really inherently wrong about the way they feel things. And so they're constantly trying to make themselves like other people. It's like they're a tulip constantly trying to be a rose, but they're not a rose, and that's okay. So of course, a lot of folks with BPD need to learn skills to work with emotions in new ways, but at least from the dialectical behavior therapy perspective, another part of what a lot of folks with BPD need is to accept themselves, like to actually accept, themselves and their emotions as they are, and let themselves be a tulip, and stop trying to force yourself into being a rose, but actually find a garden that you can thrive in, that you can grow in, and not one that is constantly trying to make you different from how you are. So that's kind of the message behind the TULiP lab is really like, it stands for treating and understanding life-threatening behavior and post-traumatic stress, which is very jargony, but it's really just a lab for a research group that's, for the tulips.
That's awesome. I need to hear that, because I remember it was tough for myself to accept, what I have. And then I remember crying myself to sleep. I didn't ask for this. Like, I don't want to be this way. Literally saying the words, I don't want to be this way. I don't want to feel everything so strongly. So, yeah.
Yeah. And, I have to say, I've had so many conversations with folks who carry the BPD diagnosis who say similar things around, like, I just don't want to be the way I am, or there's something like, I am wrong, I am bad. And none of it's true. It's like, there are like challenges for sure. There are like really intense challenges a lot of folks with BPD face, but on top of the challenges that they are facing, the last thing they need is the self-hatred that they can be taught from these really invalidating environments. So nice to try and peel that layer off.
I loved it. And I think this metaphor could be applied to everyone, because I'm sure everyone has their own struggles. So I was reading and I was like, oh, that's pretty darn cool.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think so too.
So would you mind explaining to me what exactly is it that you're doing research on? I understand it's something between it's for people with BPD and how they interact with their significant others or relationships.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. So, okay. So I spent a number of years. So I kind of grew up academically in a very DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, like lineage. Marsha Linehan was my academic grandmother, and I still practice DBT. I still study DBT, so it's not like I've left that. But a lot of the theory that treatment is based on is that what's really going on in BPD is this problem called emotion dysregulation, which you've heard of. I see you nodding. So
Yep.
this basic idea that people with BPD have intense, long-lasting emotions and have a hard time regulating those emotions. And there's a lot of good reasons to think that. A lot of people certainly experience that, and there's some evidence for that. And that we know when we try and help folks with BPD learn new ways to work with emotions, they do get better. That's how a lot of these treatments work. I did that research on this area for a number of years, though, and I kept finding sort of what we call null findings, as in I couldn't find good evidence for emotion dysregulation in BPD when I studied it. And the literature is actually really mixed. And so I started trying to understand why is it like this? I feel so clear. I think there's so many people who feel so clear that there's these emotional issues in BPD, but we can't produce a clean body of research that's supporting those ideas. And when you look across the literature, one of the patterns that emerged for me is that when folks with BPD seem to struggle with their emotions, when they seem to have these bigger or more intense or more painful reactions, it's usually in response to something interpersonal. So something going on in a relationship.
Oh yeah, I thought it's only me. Because I know that is when, I could keep it together, do fine, and then relationship stuff happens and all hell breaks loose.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense given, what I started to find in the literature and the research. And yeah, so, and it's one of those things where, I think a lot of people for a long time assumed that the emotional issues were pervasive, that a math task is going to be very, very stressful for people with BPD. And really the research shows they kind of are as stressed out as anybody else when they're doing a math task. But when they feel rejected, that's different. That's much more painful for folks who have BPD. So I started to think about that a little more and think, there's some things that are missing essentially in our BPD treatments, because we're really focused on helping people change their emotions, which makes sense, but we're not as focused on helping people work with their relationships, which is part of what's eliciting the emotion problems in the first place. So I've done a couple of things in this area. The first thing I did is myself and my colleagues developed a new theory that kind of builds on these emotional theories of BPD to kind of suggest that really BPD is not just, quote unquote, a problem of emotions. It's really a problem of relationships combined with emotions. It's when something is threatening in our interpersonal relationships, that's when we hurt. Mm-hmm. That's sort of the main idea. And the second thing I started to do is think about this idea of okay, if we're thinking about BPD in that way, then maybe we can make treatments work even better and even faster if we don't just treat the person with BPD, but we also treat their significant others at the same time. We work on their relationships and the person with BPD all at the same time, so we can kind of treat BPD, relationship functioning, and the mental health of significant others, kind of like a 3-for-1.
I love it. But what happens? I'm thinking, because I definitely needed this in the past, but I'm thinking, what if the person with BPD is now afraid of relationships?
Yeah,
because of what happened in the past.
Yeah, and that's certainly that's a real thing, right? So I think right now what we've done so far is we've developed this treatment, and we're currently delivering it and testing it in couples where one person has BPD. But not everyone has, obviously, a romantic partner or is in a relationship. So the hope is that over time, once we have a clear sense if it works or not, that we could broaden it out to people who are not just romantic partners, but any loved one. So people can kind of learn how to sit in relationships in ways that are more comfortable for them. And we can kind of transform the relationships themselves. And then if we have folks who really feel like, there's nobody in my life I would be comfortable doing that with, we're hoping to build out kind of offerings that are informed by these ideas, that are working on aspects of how we relate to other people and work with our emotions in our relationships that don't necessarily involve someone else being in the room. But I would say the other kind of really important piece of this is that BPD treatments are really hard to access. Like, it's really hard to get DBT. Waitlists are out of control long. And part of what I think we need is we need a lot of different things. We need more than just DBT. We need to really expand the offerings of what's available. So you could, some people could benefit from DBT. Some people could benefit from these like kind of more, couple-based interventions. Like, we need just more stuff that works out in the space in general. And maybe one treatment won't work for somebody and the other one will. But right now there's just not enough, period.
100%. I mean, I agree to that. Even for myself, trying to find, and people are always reaching out and saying, oh, the wait list. I mean, it depends where you're located, but I've heard in some countries, the wait list is 2 years. And I'm like thinking, damn, for someone who's suffering every day, that is a very long time.
Yeah, a week is a long time for someone who's suffering every day. Yeah, you're right. I mean, in Toronto, where I live, wait lists have been that long. They have been 2 years long. And so we have like this major, it's a crisis, essentially. It's a crisis that we need to solve. And part of my research is focused on trying to address that. I'm certainly not the only one, but yeah, it's a really, really big issue that we have good medicine and it's hard to get it to people.
But are there others that are trying to deal with the relationship aspect, both the person with BPD and say their spouse? Because that's very interesting. And I'm wondering, so is it like a DBT CBT model, or is it total different therapy?
Essentially it's designed to be a lot briefer than DBT. So standard DBT is a year long. This is designed to be 12 sessions, so about 3 months. And the idea is just simply that, like, to our point, like, it's like, we do not have a lot of resources and we need to make things that work faster. Part of the reason wait lists are so long is because DBT and our treatments are so long. It means we can't give them to a lot of people at once. So I've been really focused on trying to make things work quicker so that we can get them to more people. But the treatment itself is kind of based on DBT. So we take a lot of pieces from DBT. We take a lot of pieces from cognitive behavioral couple therapy and like family therapies that are kind of cognitive behavioral in nature. So it's not like totally off the wall. I think what's new is that we're trying to put everything into a relationship context to help people use the skills together and people help each other use skills to kind of not just, reduce BPD symptoms, but also to help relationships come closer together, build intimacy, and kind of join two people together as a team so that they are pushing back on BPD as a team instead of having like the person with BPD versus their significant other or loved one. And I actually think it makes a lot of sense for any long-term relationship. Like, if you are going into a business with somebody, it kind of functions like a marriage. Like, you are around a person a lot, you have difficult conversations, you don't always agree. It's like learning skills to have a good process with that person makes a lot of sense. And it's kind of unfortunate that that's not offered more.
I've never even it should be a thing.
It should be a thing. I'm thinking about that too. I'm like, oh man, that's another thing to make.
Well, think about it. Someone should pick it up, especially in the business world. It's a great way to revolutionize the business industry and come in with business couples therapy. What would it be? Business partners therapy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, whoever's listening to this, we're giving away golden nuggets of ideas here. So someone should pick that up. I don't have time, so someone else can do it.
They definitely should. No, that's great. And so you work with BPD and PTSD. Is it overlapping? Because I don't know. I'm told that a lot of people with BPD, it's because of PTSD or something, or because they had trauma. Is there? I mean, I'm sure. Okay, so I've heard this story, and I'm not sure where it comes from, but I've heard it more than once from different places, different sources, that there was this a convention where mental health professionals come together. Is it called APA? I don't know. It's
ABCT maybe.
a big in the US, like a big
Yeah.
convention.
Yeah.
And they were discussing that the symptoms of BPD and PTSD quite overlap. So you're, you're working with both. Is it overlapping, or how do you work with both? Or
Yeah,
why?
for sure. Oh, it's a great question. Okay, so basically, yes, there's a ton of overlap. So about half of people with borderline personality disorder have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which I'll just say in case anybody is like, what's PTSD? I'll just say really quickly, it's a disorder that sometimes follows trauma, right? So you get a bunch of symptoms that follow a trauma, where you might re-experience the trauma in some way, really want to avoid things that remind you of it, feel really jumpy or kind of dialed up or over aroused, overly anxious. And then also sometimes feel kind of numb or disconnected from things or people around you. So about half of people with BPD have PTSD, and that's a real problem because PTSD and BPD tend to make each other worse. So when people have both, they tend to have more severe versions of both disorders than the folks who have just one of the disorders alone. They kind of spiral around each other and kind of rev each other up, those two problems. And so there's been a lot of research looking at how to treat them at the same time. Or how to treat PTSD and BPD to help both problems recover. So that's one thing. There's a ton of controversy in the field around whether BPD is really just like a complex form of PTSD or complex trauma. Those kinds of terms are getting really, really, really popular. And it's a really controversial thing that people have a lot of different thoughts and opinions about. So if you're talking about a conference, like for sure, those are the kinds of things that people argue about at conferences all the time. At this point, essentially, it's complicated. Like there's a new diagnosis that's come on the scene called complex PTSD that does look a lot like BPD in terms of the actual criteria. And some studies suggest that it's its different own thing. And some studies suggest that really you can't separate the two. It's kind of like the same disorder with different names. So it really depends on like who you listen to. And at this point, I would say the research is pretty controversial. It's just kind of not clear either way. But if somebody has PTSD, whether it's complex or not, it's never simple. There's no such thing as a simple PTSD, but whether it's complex or not, we have treatments that work for it, and they're the same treatments. So that's what I normally come back to when I'm trying to sift through that kind of controversy, is that the treatments that work for PTSD work regardless of what people call it in that space.
Right. And what makes it complex, right? Gives it the C?
So the idea is that the C, it is a specific problem that is thought to come specifically from like repeated childhood interpersonal trauma, as opposed to any trauma, like, physical assault in adulthood or a car accident. And in addition to that, in addition to the PTSD symptoms that you would otherwise see, people also theoretically have problems like problems with regulating emotions, problems with their relationships, problems with their identity and sense of self. And if you know the BPD diagnostic criteria, you'd probably be thinking that sounds a lot like the BPD diagnostic criteria, which is kind of where the controversy lies. Like a lot of folks are saying, like, how are these two things really different? And some people say, oh, they do separate out. Like you can define folks who have BPD versus complex PTSD. And then a lot of other people disagree with that. And some studies show that they don't really separate out. So that's kind of exactly where like we don't really know-ness of it all comes into play. But theoretically, it is kind of like PTSD with these additional issues on top of it.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So I guess if you have a relationship, if you have BPD or PTSD, you're going to need to work on your relationships. I mean,
yes.
Again, I don't know because I don't have PTSD per se. There were professionals that, I've been to doctors who asked me, "Are you sure you don't have CPTSD?" And I'm like, at this point, just the labels, I don't know.
Well, right, exactly. I mean, and that's the thing, like most folks with BPD, like get tons of diagnoses. So like a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, people have said I've had this and this and this. And like, you really start to see how fallible the diagnostic system is when you've been through a lot of doctors like that.
Oh, yeah.
So,
I mean,
yeah.
I was diagnosed with not almost everything, but a lot of things before they figured out what I really have. Yeah. And at that point, when I was told that I have BPD, and I was made aware of it like by mistake, which was very weird. Wow. It was like a therapist told me, because you have BPD, and I'm like, what? And I didn't even know what BPD is. She's like, you have borderline, and I'm like, no, I don't. And I had no idea what borderline is, but I knew the stigma attached to that word. And she's like, why not? Like, why do you think you don't have it? I'm like, I'm not supposed to say this out loud, but I said, because isn't that like what crazy people have?
Yeah.
Like literally, I had no clue what it means. I wasn't even told. And she's like, what do you mean? It's in your charts. We all know about it. No one thought of telling me about it. Right?
That's terrible. Like, I'm sorry to hear that. But I think that your story is unfortunately really common. Like I heard so many horrible stories about the way people were told that they're diagnosed with BPD, where people are, told it, and people like, nurses or doctors say really stigmatizing things when they're telling them that. And or people go home and Google it and read all these horrible things on the internet that aren't true. And then feel like, oh my gosh, like, am I like some kind of monster? Like, what does this mean? And the truth is, like, when I tell people that they meet their experiences, meet criteria for this diagnosis, I tell them not to Google it, because it's like one of the most stigmatized, misunderstood disorders, and most of what's on the internet is like total BS. And I don't want people to go home and think these horrible things about themselves. But unfortunately, as I'm sure it's just such a stigmatized condition. And really that stigma has come from the healthcare industry itself. Like, we as healthcare providers are responsible for fixing that.
Unfortunately, yeah. So I mean, I got to give credit to that therapist, because she thought I knew.
Right.
She wasn't the one who to diagnose me. I was diagnosed in the hospital, and then I saw her. So she was sure that I know. And the way she handled it, because I was in total denial. I did not know what it is, but I did not have that.
Yes.
And also because after you've been given so many labels, and you Google every label, all those symptoms, and it does not fit like what you're experiencing. It's like, oh, it's another one of those. I didn't take her serious at first, but then she kept on bringing it up again and again and again. And I'm like, you know what? Maybe I should look into this. You know what? She told me to go home and do my research on it, actually. And I got lucky because I Googled, I YouTubed it, and I started seeing that the pieces started falling together, and I'm like, this is what I
You had that aha moment.
Like, all of a sudden, it's like, this is my life. So I'm not crazy. I mean, this is real. It's not, because I would always think like, why is my experience so different than everyone else, right? So I had and she was very supportive and very, very patient with me accepting. It took me a while to accept it. Very patient. And then she left. But isn't that how it always works? But
I know. It just sounds really lovely. I mean, I think that experience really illustrates like what diagnosis can do for people when it goes well, which is like help people realize that they're not alone, that there's something to help them understand what they're going through, is like really powerful. And it's just like really shows how diagnosis can be a really powerful, wonderful experience for people. And it can also be a really harmful experience for people, depending on how it's delivered, what people learn, like there's just so many ways to do it well. that can really like make people feel validated. Like, oh my gosh, other people feel this way too. Wow, great. And that's how I want, if somebody wants to be assessed for BPD and get a diagnosis of BPD, that's like how I want that to go for them, to then have those experiences and for it to provide hope instead of being a source of like, oh my gosh, there's something really wrong with me.
Yeah. I mean, that's if you know what BPD is all about, because like for me, I was like, I just heard borderline.
Yeah.
And my first thing was, no, I'm not that. Whatever that is, I did not know what that is, but I'm not that.
Yeah.
And then she's like, why are you so afraid? Like, why do you think it's so like, because, she asked me, why not? Why am I so afraid of it? I said, because, that's when you want to describe someone as crazy, you say borderline. She challenged me. She's like, why do you say that? Like, show me the proof. She challenged me and I'm like, I don't know. And so that's when I went home and started doing research. I was like, damn, then why do people use this and that way? Because people do that. Oh, she's so borderline. This is so borderline.
Yeah, totally.
And so that's all I knew.
Yeah, that's a pet peeve I have, is when people say somebody is borderline or somebody's so borderline, but they don't actually describe what they're talking about. Like, they don't say like, this is what this person is doing that is challenging for me, or this is the actual phenomenon I'm observing. They just say somebody's borderline. And whenever people say that to me, I go kind of glossy eyed and I just like say like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, I don't know what that means. What does that mean? Because I think people need to be more rigorous than that in describing things.
Yeah. And some people just like, I think the bipolar is also thrown around. Like, the weather is so bipolar. And I'm thinking that is so not, you should not say that. That is so not cool.
Yeah. Yeah. But, I mean, language really matters.
Yeah, it does. So, question.
Yes.
Do you have any tips for someone with BPD who is in a relationship right now? A tip on how they could, what could they do in the relationship to kind of help them or help the significant other? Or vice versa. What could the person in the relationship do to be able to help?
It's hard, like, obviously different things are going to be needed for different people. So that's like the first thing I would say about that. So all of this is kind of generic thoughts that may or may not work for any particular person. But, I think there's a few things that we are learning are really helpful for folks. One of I would say is like learning to take time outs when you're in intense conflict with somebody, before you make it worse. I think we've all had those fights with people where we get really emotional and we get a little out of control and we say things we regret. And then there's a bunch of damage we have to repair later when everything's cooled off a little bit. And I think one of the things that can be really helpful, when we teach skills in DBT, we teach people skills of like, here's how you get your emotions down in a crisis. So you don't do something that when you're really kind of drowning in emotion, that makes it worse. I think that can apply for our relationships too. Like getting some skills to say, my emotions are really intense right now. I'm going to go for a walk around the block. I want to talk to you again in 30 minutes about this, and getting out of there for a second before we say that thing or do that thing that is going to cause so much more damage to our relationship that it's going to actually be like way harder to repair. So one of the things we teach people in our couple intervention is we teach people how to figure out when they need to take a time out. And that timeout is different from like, I'm not talking to you about this anymore and storming out of the room. Like that's not helpful for relationships. So what we mean is having like an agreed upon signal, or like being able to say to somebody like, I need to take a pause, but I want to come back to this in X amount of time. And then, separating and then using some, skills like deep breathing or splashing cold water on their face to get emotions down so that they can come back and try the conversation again. And I think that's not specific to BPD. That is a skill that all of us need. I think we've all been pretty ineffective at various points in conflict or in tricky interpersonal situations. And there have definitely been times where I have been in a conversation with somebody and thought, wow, I should have taken a time out. I really regret saying that. Now I have to apologize a bunch. Now I have to like soothe my hurt partner because I said something kind of harsher than I meant to say. So I think that kind of skill can be really helpful. Learning how to feed back what you hear someone saying before you respond with your perspective and validate someone's perspective can also go a really long way. Like if somebody's saying, I'm upset that you were late for dinner, it makes me feel like you don't care about me. Usually what I will do in that situation is my mind is thinking about how I'm going to respond, like how I'm going to defend myself. Like, well, this is what happened. This is what happened. This is what happened. And the defenses might be valid, but it's pretty invalidating for the other person to hear that right off the top and feel like misunderstood by me. And it can really get conflict going. And so one thing I think that's also important for everybody, regardless of whether we have BPD or not, is really learning how to say, like, I hear this is what you're feeling. Even if we don't agree with it, like this is what I hear you saying. Here's my perspective before we just jump in with our perspective. Even little things like that can go so far in terms of helping us connect with people more. So those are just some kind of, big picture tips that come to mind.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I think, the not responding right away when you're really mad at someone, just taking time. And that's really difficult because it's like at the tip of your tongue and you're like, you got that response.
We say that like in DBT, we say like anger loves itself, right? It's like anger, when it shows up, wants you to do things that's going to keep anger going. So when I'm angry, I'm going to have the urge to like say something really rude that is going to make somebody respond to me in a rude way, which is going to make me angrier. Like angrier just wants to rev itself up. And so, yeah, it's super hard not to take that little jab when you're mad, but it can really pay off.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I wish I did it. I mean, there are so many times when if I would have kept quiet, totally, I would have been a lot better off.
I'm sure a lot, like I'm sure everyone can think of those times. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for doing this. I think, the research, because you're onto something. It definitely is. With people with BPD, I think we all struggle with, our emotions go whack, especially when it's relationship related. So you're onto something. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. And if you're looking for more participants, are you looking for more participants in the?
I am. So maybe I'll say two things about that. Thank you for that. So one is we are doing a study right now in couples where one person has BPD. That's not a treatment study, but it's just to help us understand, like, how do couples talk to each other and what kinds of ways of talking to each other are helpful and not helpful. Part of this is so we can tell like partners, like, here's what's most helpful for you in terms of how you talk to your loved one with BPD. So we are doing a study trying to study some of those communication processes and people. It's an online study, so people don't need to be near us. They can be anywhere in North America. So folks who are interested in that could email BPDstudy at YorkU, yorku.ca, or they can go to my my website, the tuliplab.ca. TULiP, it's not the TULiP Lab, just TULiP Lab for more information.
I could put a link down.
Awesome, that'd be great.
Thank you so much, Skye.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us on today's BPD Bravery Show. If you've enjoyed it, then like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. Make sure to tune into our show every Monday and Friday. And remember, you are so much more than your BPD.